Trump's new abnormal. The Trumpian economy will redefine the new normal, and it's going to be huge. How is the pundit class likely to react to the coming acceleration of real GDP growth? Despite rising incomes and job growth, the naysayers will likely respond by decrying increasing disparities in wealth and income. No doubt, such opinions will be rendered without a hint of irony regarding the actual circumstances of the purported victims of the Trump economy, blacks, Hispanics, and workers generally. The very classes the mainstream media commentariat purports to hold as the object of their concerns will all likely have seen improvements in their economic situations versus what they experienced during the Obama years. Given that reality, the media pundits will likely have to fall back on one of their favorite canards, the unfairness of the distribution of benefits in an expanding economy. What is the most likely course for the U.S. economy over the next few years? Growth rates are certain to be in excess of those experienced in the years following the Great Recession, likely doubling the average growth rate achieved during Obama's 2 terms. Given an average real GDP growth rate of approximately 2% during the Obama years, Trump's new normal has a good chance of doubling that. Indeed, it is highly likely that average growth rates will exceed 4% over the coming half-decade. Given the media's animus towards the current president, the press is likely to denigrate it in some fashion, perhaps dubbing it as the new abnormal. Though that level of growth would be quite elevated by recent standards, periods of sustained high rates of GDP growth during economic recoveries have been experienced frequently in the past. And despite several factors that might be marshaled as arguments against the outcome I am suggesting, the confluence of a variety of disparate economic trends are likely to conspire in a way that results in a temporary acceleration of growth in excess of the economy's long-run sustainable rate. In particular, the 4 economic forces that will likely bring about exactly that result are tax cuts, reduced regulatory burdens, accelerating global growth, and expanding domestic U.S. energy production. As is always the case in assessing real-world economic conditions, there are countervailing forces. Perhaps the 2 factors most likely to be cited by those expressing skepticism over the prospects for the Trump economy are policy moves by the Federal Reserve and an economic expansion that is already long in the tooth. Let me first address why these considerations are not likely to act as real constraints on growth before turning to the discussion of the factors favoring a continuation, indeed an acceleration, of the current rate of economic activity. The Federal Reserve is over a year and a half into its reversal of previous near 9 years of monetary easing. In that time, the Fed has raised its policy rate, the overnight Fed funds rate target, 5 times. Under a conventional reading of the monetary tea leaves, this would be characterized as contractionary policy. This is especially the case when considered from the Keynesian perspective of aggregate demand management, the dominant perspective of the Ivy League economists that tend to populate the Fed's Board of Governors. Indeed, Keynesianism tends to be the worldview favored by most economic policymakers, as well as that of the experts most frequently solicited for views on the economy by mainstream media journalists. Of course, this is the same group of experts that view low interest rates as fostering more rapid economic growth. The perspicacity of their perspectives should be assessed by the performance of the economy following in the wake of the policies enacted on their advice. The success of recent Fed rate policies should be evaluated by considering the effectiveness of low interest rates at fostering more rapid growth. Based on the evidence, that cadre of experts should be adjudged failures. Consider the evidence. The most recent example is the woeful performance of the developed economies in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Recent experience gives the lie to low or even negative interest rates as being particularly effective spurs to economic growth. Lest I be accused of sample bias and drawing a conclusion from an unfairly narrow sample, there are numerous examples from history that illustrate the questionable benefit of pursuing low interest rate regimes as a panacea for economic malaise. Other obvious examples are the U.S. in the 1930s and the Japanese economy since the bursting of its bubble in the late 1980s. History is replete with examples of the failure of low interest rates to stimulate higher rates of economic growth. This bit of economic history is being dragged into the discussion because of the converse aspect of the interest rate argument implicit in the conventional wisdom. The standard theory posits an inverse relationship between interest rates and economic growth. To wit, rising interest rates will result in a slowing of economic activity. That may be true, ceteris paribus, but of course, unlike in discussions of economic theories, it is never possible in the real world to hold everything else constant. Perhaps unsurprisingly, just as low interest rates don't automatically stimulate higher growth rates, historically, periods of rapid economic growth often coincide with relatively high rates of interest. Stock market forecasters and economic prognosticators have various rules of thumb for projecting the timing of any impact from Fed policy on the real economy. Such arbitrary rules are no substitute for a rational assessment of actual economic circumstances. Market pundits and economic forecasters will frequently cite an arbitrary number of rate increases, 3 hikes and a stumble is an old favorite, or some period of time from the initiation of a new policy direction. 12 to 18 months is a time period frequently bandied about as the impact lag for monetary policy shifts, as inevitably leading to the onset of a turn in the business cycle. Even a cursory review of economic history should disabuse one of the accuracy of such forecasting tools. Naturally, what actually matters is the amount by which interest rates have been increased and the existing level of interest rates before the rate-raising regime was instituted. Further, those factors have to be considered in the context of the supply of and demand for capital, as well as the level of economic activity and the proximity of potential constraints on growth, such as resource availability and bottlenecks in production capacity. In the current context, none of these issues is likely to restrain the economy as long as the Fed stays on its current course. If the Fed continues to raise rates for the balance of Trump's initial term in a fashion consistent with its policy over the past year, the interest rate environment is not likely to represent a serious impediment to an acceleration of GDP growth. Indeed, the Fed is likely to continue its rate-raising policy for the foreseeable future, absent a recession. In one sense, that is quite amusing, as the Fed had deferred raising interest rates for more than 7 years into an expansion because of its stated fears over the fragility of the economy. Now, at a stage where many are saying the economy is due for a slowdown, the Fed has been raising rates somewhat aggressively. Isn't it amazing how their fears of crashing the economy evaporated as soon as a Republican was elected? Gee, funny how it works out like that, huh? Nonetheless, despite the fact the Fed will probably enact 3 to 5 rate increases per year for the next several years, and that on top of the 5 quarter-point increases enacted over the last year and a half, interest rates will not likely reign in the U.S. economy. Assuming 12 or so quarter-point rate increases over the next 3 years, short-term rates will not be much above the lowest levels for such rates over the course of the 1980s and 90s, decades during which the U.S. experienced some of its highest rates of growth over the last 3 generations. So in and of themselves, higher short-term interest rates will not likely prove a serious impediment to a stronger economy. The other commonly cited concern is that the economy has already been expanding for nearly 9 years. How much longer can the expansion continue? It is true that the current expansion has already been among the longest in U.S. economic history. However, that is not as great a cause for concern as it might seem. The current expansion is quite long compared to the historic average if the yardstick one is using is the average business cycle over the last 2 centuries. However, if one considers only the expansion since the recession that ended in late 1982, the current one is not significantly longer than the average of those recent expansions. A study of economic history would show that each business cycle is unique and needs to be analyzed on its own merits. Recessions don't always kick in after a specified number of months or quarters have passed since the previous one ended. Though not responsible for the incidence of every recession, Federal Reserve Board policy probably deserves credit for the timing of the onset of every recession since its creation in 1913. Per the above discussion, said policy is not likely to result in a recession beginning any time in the next few years if the Fed holds steady to its recent course. Absent Fed policy as a concern, the primary factors that would lead to a recession would be a lack of capital to fund real investment or economic bottlenecks created by either resource constraints or limits on productive capacity. So let's turn to an assessment of how likely it is that any of these considerations would hold back economic growth. A strong case can be made that none of these factors will likely prove constraints. Indeed, they may be factors that contribute to fostering higher rates of GDP growth. The world is still awash in financial capital. Though starting to take back some of the liquidity with which they flooded the world financial system in recent years, central banks have a long way to go before their actions would put a serious dent in the excess reserves currently sloshing around the banking system. Using the U.S. Fed as an example, its balance sheet is still approximately 5 times its size in 2007. The excess reserves held by banks are so large that the Fed's greatest concern is not a lack of liquidity. Rather, it is that those reserves will lead to excessively rapid money creation, resulting in a spike in inflation rates. The liquidity in the banking system is but one of the factors contributing to the ready availability of capital to finance investment in plant and equipment. The recently enacted tax plan creates incentives for U.S. corporations to repatriate the retained earnings they've been holding overseas. Beyond the excess reserves in the banking system and the repatriation of overseas earnings, there will likely be an increase in operating profits that can also be used to finance increased investment. The consequence of these factors is that the supply of capital is likely to be more than adequate to fund increasing real investment. Nor is either resource availability or productive capacity likely to act as a brake on an accelerating economy. Since the economy has been growing at well below its potential for over a decade, there is still plenty of slack in terms of both of those factors. Resource and commodity prices are relatively low, indicating they are relatively abundant. The economic input that is seemingly least abundant is labor. Indeed, many would cite the low unemployment rate as a major cause for concern. That is especially true of the neo-Keynesians who have been trying to resurrect the discredited Phillips curve, an economic theory that purported to show a fixed trade-off between inflation rates and unemployment rates. The many fallacies embedded in the conceptual underpinnings of the Phillips curve are too numerous to address here. Suffice it to say that Milton Friedman demolished the theoretical foundation of the theory back in the 1960s. Friedman's informed critique and the behavior of the economy in regards to inflation rates versus unemployment rates over the subsequent 4 decades should have buried that theory forever. Any concerns about worker availability and wage rates should be allayed by a number of factors. At several points over recent decades, unemployment rates have been even lower than at present without there being a significant spike in inflation. Considered on their own, high wage rates are not an unmitigated negative for 2 reasons. For one, wage rates have grown below trend for some period of time, so a bit of catch-up for worker compensation is likely in order. In addition to that, higher wages would mean greater levels of consumption spending, thus reinforcing economic growth rates. Further, labor force participation rates are near multi-decade lows, implying a ready source of labor supply if higher wages induce discouraged workers to re-enter the labor force. Aside from resource availability and labor supply, the remaining possible real constraint would relate to the economy's stock of physical capital, its plant and equipment. Here again, there is no obvious inadequacy of physical capital that would hold back an acceleration of growth. Capacity utilization rates are nowhere close to levels that usually signal approaching problems. Further, the economy's productive capacity has been made more flexible by the advance of technology. The proximity of production bottlenecks has likely been pushed out even more by investment activity over the past year. This is a direct consequence of the expansion of business investment spending that followed the Trump election and the ensuing lightening of regulatory burdens. Investment spending is likely to accelerate further due to incentives put in place by the recently enacted Republican tax plan, which should reduce concerns over any inadequacy of the capital stock to support increasing rates of GDP growth. With those countervailing factors that some would argue might constrain growth having been addressed, let me focus on the economic drivers that will likely push rates of growth to levels not seen since the mid-1980s. During the campaign, Trump spoke a number of times about the potential for the U.S. economy to reach 4% real GDP growth, a prediction regularly panned by media commentators. Given the recent past and current state of the economy, there are four distinct economic factors which in combination are likely to result in the U.S. being able to attain average growth rates near that level for the balance of the term to which Trump was elected in 2016. As noted earlier, these four factors are tax cuts, reduced regulatory burdens, an expanding global economy, and increasing U.S. energy production. Let's consider each of those in some detail. Every significant tax cut enacted in U.S. history has proven a fillip to growth rates. Though I could cite the impact of tax reductions going back even further, examples drawn from the last several generations should suffice to make the case. The income tax rate cuts by Kennedy in the early 60s, Reagan in the early 80s, and Bush the Younger early in the new millennium resulted in recessionary or slow growth economies experiencing significant spurts in GDP growth rates. The additional rate cuts by Reagan in the late 80s and the capital gains rate reduction by Clinton in the mid-90s resulted in notable acceleration for economies already growing at good to moderate rates. And in all of the cited cases, the pickups in growth rates persisted for some number of years after the programs were first enacted. Consequently, even though the U.S. economy is currently growing at a reasonably good clip, the impact of the recent tax rate reductions should cause the growth rate to accelerate at least a bit. That should be especially true given the specific composition of the recently enacted tax plan. The greatest reduction was in the rates that will apply to corporate profits. The impact of those cuts should be amplified by the enhanced expensing of investment in capital assets. In combination, those changes to the tax code should prove strong inducement to expanded business investment, perhaps the most important factor for sustained increases in GDP growth rates. That should prove especially beneficial over time due to the consequence for worker productivity. The growth of worker productivity has a huge impact on both corporate profits and increases in wage rates in the long run. Though they are not as important for GDP growth, the smaller cuts in individual tax rates will serve as a further support to increasing levels of economic activity. Perhaps the leading contributor to the higher growth rates experienced over the last year has been the reduction in regulatory burdens. No doubt the effect has been multiplied by the related lessening of concerns about how that burden would have increased had the election turned out otherwise. One of the greatest flaws in conventional economic theory is how much it downplays the impact of regulation on the private economy. Economic textbooks focus on fiscal and monetary policy as the primary levers through which government actions impact the economy. regulatory policy is often mentioned as almost an afterthought, very much soft-pedaled relative to the weight given to monetary and fiscal policy moves. Consequently, though it amounts to a hidden tax on private economic activity, most of the economics professoriate acts as if increases in regulation imposes almost no cost on the economy. Indeed, based on their faux cost-benefit analyses, government economic advisors often manage to conclude regulations result in net benefits to the economy rather than the deadweight loss they often prove to be. The reduction in regulatory burdens is likely to be an ongoing spur to economic activity. This is true not only due to the burdens already lifted, but also the anticipation of further reductions in regulatory costs in the future. That belief is buttressed by several factors. One consideration is the Trump rule requiring agencies to eliminate 2 existing rules for every new one they wish to write. Of even greater importance is the impact on business expectations based on the new mindset in Washington and the business-friendly attitudes apparent in the department heads being appointed by the Trump administration. Like the tax cuts discussed previously, the reduction in regulatory burdens is likely to be a continuing accelerant of economic growth rates for the entirety of the Trump administration. Though international trade has a lesser impact on the U.S. economy compared to other large economies, the U.S. is not a closed economic system. Given the relatively small size of its international sector, the previously cited tax and regulatory factors would likely enable the U.S. economy to ward off any negative impacts of global economic headwinds if that were the economic environment extant today. The reality is that economic conditions seem to be improving in most regions around the globe. As a result, increasing growth rates globally are likely to magnify the beneficial impacts of domestic tax and regulatory actions. Though not universal, most geographies around the globe are experiencing pickups in the level of economic activity. The major exception to that would be on the Mediterranean coast of Africa and in the Middle East, where political turmoil and lower energy prices have put a spanner in the works for many Muslim countries. In most other regions, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, India, China, and the rest of East Asia, economic growth could be characterized as either recovering, maintaining good rates of growth, or seeing an acceleration of already healthy growth rates. This can only be a positive, both for exports by U.S.-based businesses and for returns on U.S. companies' overseas investments. Though not completely independent of the above-cited factors, growth in domestic U.S. energy production deserves special mention for several reasons. Due primarily to the rapid evolution of hydraulic fracturing technology, the U.S. has become the #1 producer of both crude oil and natural gas. Though still a net importer of crude oil, imports have declined dramatically over the last half-dozen years and are likely to continue to shrink. Indeed, due to the recently mooted increases in the leasing of drilling rights, both offshore and in the ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve, the U.S. could become a net exporter of crude within the next 5 to 10 years. Even if that doesn't come to pass, the U.S. is already a net exporter of refined crude products, and those net exports will surely continue to increase. Further, the U.S. may become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas as LNG export facilities and tanker fleets are expanded to facilitate the development of that market. However, the greatest benefits for the U.S. economy may not be the positive impact on the balance of payments flowing from increased domestic energy production. There are 2 other distinct advantages that will likely accrue to the country's benefit as a result of expanding oil and gas output. One benefit that has only begun to be realized is the inflow of foreign investment in the U.S. as it is increasingly seen as an ongoing source of low-cost energy. Added to the country's relative political stability, the long-run price outlook regarding domestic energy supplies is just beginning to serve as a major driver of foreign corporations investing in U.S.-based manufacturing facilities. Industries for which energy represents a significant cost will find the U.S. an increasingly attractive location for siting production facilities. Additionally, the U.S. will be an ever more desirable location for siting manufacturing operations for the many businesses for which crude oil or its distillates are an important feedstock, and that category encompasses a wide range of industries such as chemicals, fertilizers, paints, plastics, and more. An entirely separate dimension of the economy is also greatly benefited due to the impact on energy supplies and consequently the price of energy: consumer purchasing power. The existing reduction in energy costs generally, and gasoline prices in particular, have given U.S. consumers the equivalent of a major tax cut already. As U.S. oil and gas production continues to expand, the benefit to consumer spending power will likely be yet another ongoing enhancer of GDP growth rates. Though energy prices may not decline much further, the expansion in U.S. hydrocarbon production is likely to prevent any significant increase in energy prices for the foreseeable future. Obviously, the above forecast is subject to many caveats. Should Rocket Man fire off a few nukes, or the Ayatollah decide to incinerate Tel Aviv, all bets are off. However, absent a major military confrontation or a huge misstep by economic policymakers in an important economy, the circumstances cited previously should result in a smooth glide path to higher growth rates for the U.S. economy. So yes, all bets are off if a geopolitical confrontation results in a nuclear exchange. Similarly, policy miscues could tank the economy. One could easily imagine the ECB mishandling Grexit, or the Fed choking off growth because of a mistaken belief that 4% real GDP growth would mean an overheating economy that will lead to runaway inflation. However, absent missiles flying or a major economic policy faux pas, the confluence of favorable economic forces cited above should lead to the highest sustained growth rates for any 5-year period since the years coming out of the twin recessions of the late 1970s and early 80s. This is Dismal Scienter signing off until next time.